It has been a trashy month. Let's air it out. Welcome to the depths. Welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for joining me again today. So this is my reading wrap-up for the month of August 2024, which was GarbAugust, which was intense. It was an intense month. I did way more reading than I probably should have. I think I read more titles than I've ever read in a month, due to a number of factors. One of the big factors is I live at this monastery and I'm part of this academic program, this 25-year-long intense study program, and we follow the Tibetan lunar calendar as our academic calendar. And due to the weirdness of a lunar calendar, this year has 13 months instead of 12. And so the sixth month was repeated. There's the upper sixth and the lower sixth. And just where that falls in our calendar, most of August lined up with the lower sixth month. And it was just more relaxed than normal because we literally had a whole extra month of restudying things we'd already worked on. So because of that, I had a little more free time than normal. And I put all that free time into GarbAugust, for better or worse. So this month I read 28 titles, which is insane for me, way more than I ever read. Of those 28, though, 5 of them were short story collections and 7 of them were novellas, so only 16 were novels. Of those novels, most of them were between the 200 and 300 page mark, though there was one that was around 700 pages and another that was around 600 pages. So there were a few chunky ones. Most were between 200 and 300, a few a little higher, a few a little lower. So it was a busy month, so that means this video is definitely going to be long. I'm going to do my best to keep it short. I definitely know now why other people who are doing reviews for GarbAugust do weekly wrap-ups instead of monthly wrap-ups. I do want to go through all the books really quickly, and I also want to share some of my thoughts about GarbAugust and my experience being this intense for the month and GarbAugust as a whole, so I'll do that at the end. I'll put timestamps down in the bottom if you want to jump to that, if you get bored of the book after book after book. But that's what you're here for, right? So let's get into the books. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the prompts that I hit and all of the bingo square cards that I covered. At the end, I will just mention what prompts I covered and everything, but I'm not going to go through title by title because I will just take too long to do it. I'm just going to go through the books in the order I read them. So the first book I finished in the month was The Night Silver River Run Red by Christine Morgan, and this is a novella, and it's another one of the Splatter Western series. So I have this project to read all of the novels and novellas that are part of the Splatter Western series. This is a series published by Dead Sky Publishing under the imprint of Death Heads Press, and they are exactly what they sound like. They are mostly novellas, though some novels, that are all set in like a Western genre, but they mash up often with horror or with other genres, with splatterpunk. They're bloody, they're fun, and this one was no exception. I already did a review of this on my channel, so I won't speak more to it here, but it was a lot of fun, and I'm having a great time with the series. I think I've read 7 of them so far, and there are about 24 total in the series, so slowly I'm making my way through it. The next book I read was The Cabin in the Woods, the official movie novelization by Tim Lebbon, and I loved the movie Cabin in the Woods when it came out. It's this meta horror movie that lovingly pokes at the genre in the smartest of ways. Recently, last month actually, I had gotten excited about reading some more movie novelizations, and I saw this one. I thought this was the perfect month to read it, and I wasn't let down. I thought I did all the things that a good movie novelization has to do, which is keep all of the excitement and fun of the movie, but give you more interiority and fill in the blanks that a movie can't do that more personal narration can do. So I loved it. I thought it was great. I thought it did a good job of representing the movie and giving you just a little bit extra. The next novel I read was Alien Prototype by Tim Waggoner. And over the last year, I have heard a lot of good things and high praise about a number of different books in the Alien franchise, spin-offs that is. And so I've been meaning to read some of these. And of the ones I heard most spoken about, this isn't one of them, but I came across it and I know the name Tim Waggoner from some other novelizations of movies that he's done. And it seemed interesting, and also it seemed shorter than the other ones. And so I decided to pick it up, and I'm really glad I did. It had both the military sci-fi and the horror elements that sometimes, at least in the movies, in the Alien franchise, you can have more of one than the other. And this, I thought, was a great combination of both of those things. There was a version of the xenomorph called a necromorph that was basically a xenomorph that had been infected with this flesh-eating disease, and that became part of its tool set and one of this new weapon that it could possess. So I thought that was really fun. I thought the balance here was great. I thought the humor, the action, everything was fun in the story. I had a great time with it. And actually, the main character in this story is in other alien media as well. So I already picked up another novel that she's in, and I'm looking forward to reading it because I had a great time. The next title I finished was one of my short story collections, and this one is called Evil Little Fucks. It was edited by R.E. Sargent and by Stephen Pajak, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It is very exploitative. Some of the stories were quite great. Some of them were over the top. Some were ridiculous. The reason creepy kids is a whole thing is because kids are supposed to be this paradigm of innocence and of virtue, and whenever that is flipped, it becomes unsettling. Many of the stories in this collection were able to like utilize that to really good effect. Some of them were just shocking for the sake of being shocking, but a few of them I thought were really, really hard hitting and a lot of fun to read. So this is a good collection. The next book I read is called Evil in Me by Brom, and this is an advanced reader copy, and I will have a review coming up later in the month. And previously to this, I had read Brom's novel Slewfoot, which I loved. I thought was great. The basic plot of this one is that the protagonist, it's set in the 1980s, and the protagonist is a young woman who is a punk rocker, and she becomes possessed for one reason or another, and she needs to break the possession before it takes her over for good. And the way to do that is to basically recite a spell, which in this case is a song, and to get a number of people to sing along and recite the spell with her to increase its power. So that's like the main thrust of the story. You know, I thought there was a lot interesting in the story. I thought flipping the possession angle on its head, that usually the rock and roller seeks out the devil and that's how they get famous. Here, it's an unwanted possession. So I thought that was interesting. I did not like this as much as Slewfoot. I thought there was just a little bit that was undeveloped and underdeveloped, and I would have liked a little more in depth in some things. But it was still fun. I had a good time with it. I'll have a full review of this coming up a little later. The next title I finished was another collection, and this is a collection called Spyfunk by Milton J. Davis, or edited by him rather. And this is one of a series of anthologies that are all focused on different genres, and the writers are all celebrating people from Africa and the African diaspora. And this one is Spyfunk, but he also has steampunk, cyberfunk, dieselfunk, and space funk. And I'd heard about them because Spyfunk is the newest one, and that I saw it on Kickstarter. So they're all spy stories or versions of spy thriller espionage stories written by either Africans or people from the African diaspora. Overall, you know, any collection like this was going to be hits and misses. I don't think anything stood out as being really stellar, like blow my socks off amazing, but it was still a lot of fun to read, and a number of them were quite strong. And, you know, I enjoyed it. And I hopefully will get a chance to read some of the other anthology collections that he has edited. We'll see. Now, the next book I read, actually, I didn't read it due to GarbAugust. This is just one I had been wanting to read. This was Mirrored Heavens by Rebecca Roanhorse. This was the last book in her Between Earth and Sky trilogy, and which is this epic or high fantasy which is set, all the different cultures and communities are based on cultures and communities of the indigenous Americas. And I loved this. I thought this was great. This was a honker of a book, around 600 pages. All three of the books in the trilogy are. But I just thought this was phenomenal. I was worried going into it because it's been 2 years since the last book, and there is a lot of detail in these books, and I was worried I didn't remember it all. So I tried to kind of refresh my memory, but going into it, the writing is so strong that she carries your hand through, and the things that you may have forgotten, she's able to reintroduce in ways that you don't feel dumb. You don't feel like information is just being handed to you. You're welcome back into the world. It has a lot of action. It has a lot of heart. It explores different ideas of religiosity and what it means to follow an old god or a new god, what it means to have politics replace religion. It was just a lot of fun. I can't recommend this trilogy enough. The Between Earth and Sky trilogy. This is the last book called Mirrored Heavens. I had a great time with this. I'm really glad I got a chance to read it. Next, I read a Doctor Who novelization. And, you know, I have to admit, I've never seen Doctor Who. I'm an American, and when I was young, we didn't have access to BBC the way we do now. And up through even college, I had friends that would watch Doctor Who, but you had to have a DVD set. It's not something you could just stream easily. Now you can access it much more easily than you could, back when I was young. I know the general outline of Doctor Who, and I know that I would enjoy it. I also know I just don't have time to add another long-running series into my, to cram into my very limited free time. So I have avoided it. But I've wanted to read some of the novelizations that would at least, open the door a little bit for me and give me one foot in that world. This is a novelization by Paul Magrs, and I'm going to be honest, when I chose this, it was really just because of the cover. I know Paul Magrs a little bit simply because I've seen some of his videos on YouTube. He also has a YouTube channel, and I know he's written a lot of Doctor Who novels. And I looked at which ones I had access to, and this one I just thought was wild. And so this is Doctor Who, Mad Dogs and Englishmen. And it is actually the 100th Doctor novel, and it's the 52nd novel that features the 8th Doctor. And so, of course, I did a little research going into it. And so, any of you who know Doctor Who will know this already, but the 8th Doctor, famously, I think was only in film once. I think they're trying to make a Doctor Who series that would take off in America, and it failed. But the pilot or the opening of that featured the 8th Doctor. And so he was not famously in film at all. He only exists in the novels, basically. And, this novel, I really picked it because of the cover. I mean, who can't? It's a poodle with human hands and a gun. Like, what are you going to say? And really, that is the heart of the story. There is a planet of dogs that are all poodles, and they have human hands. I had a lot of fun with this story. I think it took a little longer to get going than it should have. The plot is really bonkers. It actually is following an author in our world, and he is writing his like magnum opus, but it's the only thing he's written, and it's taken him like his whole life to write it, 50, 60, 70 years, something like this. And it's basically like a Lord of the Rings style fantasy. But at some point in the timeline, after he's died, someone has swapped out his book for this book that's all about Dog Planet and these dogs and a rebellion that happens on Dog Planet. And then a famous movie is made of it. And basically the Doctor finds out about this, and he feels a need to correct the timeline. And then you find out the Dog Planet is a real place, and this movie is being used as propaganda to incite a rebellion. And so there are like people from the Dog Planet, or I guess dogs from the Dog Planet, that want to stop this from happening. And then there's an agency called Meow. I don't remember what it stands for, but it's basically an agency of agents who are trying to make sure that the temporal rigidity or temporal framework never changes. So they're trying to stop this from happening, and the Doctor gets involved. And, it's just wacky. I will say, and I don't know if this is common to a lot of the stories in Doctor Who universe, but it felt like things happened around the Doctor, that they weren't that instrumental to move the plot forward. He definitely knew what was going on. He had smart deductions, and he put pieces in play, but ultimately the story happened around him. Like, he didn't feel like the Doctor or his compatriots really pushed the plot. They just kind of observed it. So I would have liked them to push it a little more. But, anyway, the novel was a lot of fun. I mean, with a cover like that, of course it has to be fun. I will say there's a lot of like meta jokes about what it means to be a writer and to be writing a great work of literature. And there was also just a lot of really fun humor. Like, for instance, there's a character named Char, and at one point it goes, Char sneered, "I don't read very much, I'm afraid." "Oh, you prefer the telly?" "It's realer somehow." "And the books don't count then?" Char grimaced at him. Like, these little things. Or he mentions, that movie, The Lord of the Rings, that was made by John Waters, and it stars Bette Davis as Sauron and Joan Crawford as Gandalf the Witch. Like, those little things I think were really great and a lot of fun. So this is great. I look forward to reading more Doctor Who stories. Since I don't have any investment in the continuity or in the characters, I can kind of pick any of them up and expect a good time. And so that's what I got here. Next, another short story collection. This is A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez. And I also read this as an advanced reader copy, so there'll be a longer review coming up later. I loved this. I thought it was great. I had read Our Share of Night, and I was a little disappointed in it, largely because I thought the hype was really high, and it was too long. I just thought it went on longer than it needed to. And that is not the case here. This is a dozen short stories. They all have this really dark tone. They're technically horror. They're not, for the most part, not that graphic, sometimes a little bit. But it's more about setting a really dark, ominous tone, almost gothic in its presentation. And these are great. I highly recommend it. I'll have a full review coming out later in the month. Next, I read another novella. This is The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, very famous. And for me, this is actually part of another reading project I'm doing, My Novel Life, which is where you read a different story starting with the year you birth up till now. And so this was from 1986. And I had obviously seen the movie, and I have to say, I liked the novella better. I thought it gave us more interiority on Frank, on the main character, and I think having already seen the movie, I had the visuals, and the movie was also made by Clive Barker, right? So these were visuals that he wanted it to be. So I had a sense of the visuals already, and I was able to bring those to the novella with me. Whereas if I experienced them in the opposite order, where I had the novella first and then the movie, I think the movie might be more overwhelming because the visuals are so outstanding, right? But since I already had those, going into the novella, I really enjoyed this. I actually liked it more than the movie probably, which may be not everyone will agree with that sentiment, but I thought it was a lot of fun. So that is The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. Then the next book I read was one of the Nick Carter Killmaster series. So this was part of, my men's adventure book. So this is Nick Carter, Seven Against Greece. Supposedly written by Nick Carter, but this one is really written by Nicholas Browne in 1967. And I was able to get this at a little used bookstore. And, this is exactly what you expect, like a James Bond type story to be. It was a lot of fun. There was sex, there was violence. There was sex very shortly followed by violence. What I did like about it was the inventive ways they kept putting the main character in peril. So he's not going to die, which unfortunately means people around him get hurt and die because he can't die since he's continuing in this series. But he kept like messing up. Like he wasn't a perfect spy. He kept making mistakes and being put in difficult situations, which I thought was really exciting. And it always felt like there were stakes, even though you knew he was never going to die. So I thought, it was a lot of fun. The politics were really interesting. It wasn't nearly as misogynist as I expected it to be. So, Killmaster, there you go. Moving on. Next was a smutty male-on-male monster book. This was Soul Eater by Lily Mayne. And this was as close as I'm going to get to a category romance, I think, which is why I read this. And it was fine. It was exactly what it sounds like. Smutty male-on-male monster and demon smut. I thought the world building was actually interesting. I thought the main characters were interesting, and I liked them. The plot sizzled out. Like once the smut started happening, then the whole like second half of the book, it was really like after you had the build up and the character development, and they kind of started going at it. Then the rest of the book was them just going to a new place to then go at it again, and then go somewhere else and go at it again. And the whole plot from like the maybe second half or at least the last third of the book could have been condensed into like 15 pages. So I would have liked the plot to be a little more interesting at the back half, instead of just moving their smutty activities from one location to another, which is what it felt like. But I don't know. Like, I don't know what do you expect from human demon, male on male smut. Like, that's what you're going to get. So it was fine. It was fun. And this is actually a recommendation from Alex Unabridged, because I was thinking of what I could do for category romance, because that's one of the most out of my real wheelhouses for all different genres. And I saw he recommended this, and I said that's probably as close as I'm going to get. So it was fun. I'm glad I read it. Will I read more in the series? Probably not, but who knows? There are like another half dozen books in the series, each one focusing on a different demon. So we'll see. Never say never, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, moving on. The next book I read is called Good Dogs by Brian Asman. And this is another advanced reader copy, so there'll be a review coming later. This is another werewolf story. It's an interesting one, a group of werewolves that live together as a pack, a found family, and they're trying to keep themselves safe so they don't hurt humans. And they find out by accident at the beginning of the story, one of them has killed a human, so they try to then move themselves to an old abandoned town, like a ghost town, that is away from normal civilization with the hopes that they can live there without being a threat to others. Yet they find out there is something already living there that begins stalking them. So it's like a slasher movie, but the werewolves are the victims. It was fun. I enjoyed it. I thought it was good. Brian Asman, you might know, he's the author of Man F This House, and he's written a number of other novellas. And you could tell, or at least it felt like, clearly someone who is used to writing in the novella space, writing a novel. So it didn't feel stretched out, but it felt like there were places where he could have gone much more in depth and done a lot more character work and just repositioned the narrative a little bit, to make it almost more indulgent, to make it rounder. And the things that you have to cut out to make a good novella are places that you can luxuriate in a novel. And he set things up perfectly, but I don't think he exploited all of the seed that he had planted as well as he could have. But it was still a lot of fun, especially if you like werewolf stories. This is an interesting take on the werewolf mythos. So I have a full review of that coming up later, so you can look forward to that. Next was another collection of short stories. This is called Found, an anthology of found footage horror stories, edited by Andrew Cull and Gabino Iglesias. And I love this cover. It's just like old VHS, and even on the side, this was great. It was a really wonderful collection. It was a combination of stories that were written as found footage stories. So basically epistolary stories. Some of them are like diary entries. Some of them are like messages back and forth. Some of them are like responses on a blog, like that. And others were stories about found footage. So the characters encountered found footage. So it was a little combination of both. And there were some stories in this that were like really, really great, that really grabbed me. There were a few duds, but overall, this is a great collection. I think found footage is inherently trashy. So this was a really wonderful collection to read here. Yeah, I definitely recommend it. I thought it was great. So next, I read a couple of novellas back to back, 3 novellas, and these are all part of the Rewind or Die series. So Rewind or Die is a bunch of trashy novellas. The whole premise is that they're all like splatter novellas, and the through line is like imagine yourself going to the video rental store in the 80s or 90s, and those really graphic over the top covers for some of the VHS movies in the horror section. That is what inspires these stories. I think there's like 40 of them in the series. They're not connected in any way for the most part. And I'd already read one book from the Rewind or Die series. I think Transmuted is called, by Eve Harms. I read that last year and I thought it was fun. But again, similar to the Splatter Western series, so there's no real through line connecting them. So it just depends on the author. And there can be, really, really high highs and really low lows. You never know. In this case, the first 2 books I read were by Zachary Ashford. And the first one is called Soul Survivor. And the second one is Soul Survivor 2, Drop Bears in the Loose. These are creature features. And these were great. These were so much fun. These are a spin on the Survivor TV show. And the whole premise in the first one is a group of contestants are on a plane to make their way to be part of a reality show, a Survivor-style reality show, but the plane crashes on an island before they can get to their destination. They don't get to meet the host. They don't get to meet the camp. They don't get to do any of these things. Yet you find out that this is the actual show. Like this was the plan all along. And this island is covered in cameras. But meanwhile, there are these beasts on the island that just start killing them, one after the other, ripping through them in the most gruesome, disgusting of ways. And it's fun. You have a big cast of characters at the beginning. They get like cut down really quickly. But what's fun about it is since they are the cast of characters for a Survivor style reality show, any of these reality shows have archetypes, right? In order to create dramatic tension. So our characters fit those storylines and they know that they've been cast for that reason. So they lean into it or they rebel against it, depending on the character. And it was bloody. It was fun. It's a creature feature that it features drop bears, and if you ever meet anyone from Australia or you know anyone from Australia, just ask them about drop bears and they'll tell you a story. So I had a great time. And then there was a sequel, and the sequel, Drop Bears on the Loose, was even more fun. And now I won't say who survived from the first one, but the survivor or survivors are back on mainland Australia, and basically the drop bears have been released in Australia and start causing mayhem. At the same time, you also have an extra antagonist, which is the billionaire that owns the production company. He's the one working and creating these like genetically modified drop bears who are stronger, faster, and they breed more quickly. So the threat is like multiplied. And the survivors from the first one are under contract still to promote this TV show, which aired, even though, the majority of the cast was murdered gruesomely. It still aired on TV and was like a #1 hit. And so they're under contract. And they're trying to escape like constant surveillance from him. At the same time, there is like an extremist, almost cult-like group who are militant vegans who have decided that since these survivors killed all these innocent animals on the island, an example has to be set. So they are going to basically murder them on live TV as well. So that's another antagonist. And you have all these crazy drop bears just like wreaking havoc and just murdering people left and right. It was a lot of fun. It was bloody. It was gruesome. They're both novellas. They're like less than 100 pages each. I read them both in essentially one sitting, back to back, and they were great. Next novella, also in the Rewind or Die series, is called Chopping Spree. And this is by Angela Sylvaine. And this is a slasher set in a mall. And it's set in the current day, but the mall is a 1980s themed mall. And, not everything is as it seems, which I like that idea of this facade, right? The mall itself is pretending to be a 1980s mall, so of course nothing is how it seems to us. And this was also fun. If anything, I thought this could have been built out to be a little longer. I thought that the characters all felt realistic, but I would have liked to spend more time with all of them. And sure enough, when I was leaving my review for this on GoodReads, I saw that the author is publishing a new version coming out later this month. I don't think with the same press, with a different press, and it's going to be 30 pages or so longer. So my guess is, or my hope is, that she spends more time filling out these characters, because I think that would be interesting. But as it was, this was a lot of fun as well. So whether you get the original copy or the new copy, I do recommend it. Moving on, another classic, The Kraken Awakes by John Wyndham. This was not at all what I expected it to be. I thought it was going to be about some deep sea sci-fi, but it was not. It was about aliens. essentially. It was great. I thought this was really wonderful. I will say what I love about this is that so the book was written in 1953. My version is from 1985 or so, and so at the front it has just a short biography of the author. And he is based in England. The whole story is set in England, but he was writing for publications in America a lot of the time. And he didn't only write sci-fi; he wrote a number of different genres. And so there's this one line in his bio where it says, in 1946, he went back to writing stories for publication in the USA and decided to try a modified form of what is unhappily known as science fiction, in quotes. Thought that was great. This is a wonderful story. The narrative structure is that the main character and his wife are both, they write news stories for radio broadcast. It's got 3 main sections and a prologue. The prologue is only 1 or 2 pages. And in the prologue, he basically says, I think I'm going to write a novel about everything that's just happened to us. And then the rest of the story is that novel. And I think it's wonderful. And he says, he's talking to his wife, and you don't know where they are. There's very little setup. They're just standing, watching a bunch of icebergs. That's all you know. And he says, I think I said that I shall write an account of all this. You mean a long one? About the whole thing? A book? Phyllis asked. Well, I don't suppose it will ever be a printed book with stiff covers and a cloth binding, but still, a book, I agreed. I suppose a book is still a book, even if no one but the writer and his wife ever reads it, she said. Which kind of summed up the idea of trashy fiction for me in many ways. A book is still a book. This was great. It was a little slow. Yeah, it wasn't like full of action scenes. There was actually almost no action. There were a lot of moments of like gasping and of fear and like concern, but it wasn't like there was no like action scenes. But I thought it was great. I thought it was also really fun just to look at the politics of the time and the way they talked about Russians and the Chinese and how that affected the decision-making process of the governments when they were engaging with like this alien foe. So that was a lot of fun. The Kraken Awakes by John Wyndham. Moving on, another book that I read an early advance copy of. This is called The Black Hunger by Nicholas Pullen. He's a Canadian author. And this, I have an extended review coming out later in the month. Yeah, this was interesting. This is set in the early 20th century, and the character is a British scholar, and he studies Orientalist studies, which is to say East Asian studies, or Asian studies, and he studies Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, and the story takes him to northern India and to Tibet and to Mongolia, and it's a story that has like this occult horror story of like a nihilistic Buddhist death cult, and he is tasked with trying to stop this cult. The story itself I thought was fun. I thought it was really well written. I felt like I get more into this in my extended review. Obviously the character is 20th century, British character. So I expect him to have certain levels of prejudice. But there did feel like from the authorial voice or the narrative voice, also a lack of complete understanding of Tibetan Buddhism and more of like a historical or encyclopedic level understanding. And because of that, it felt almost appropriative or exploitative, as opposed to celebrating. And you don't see Buddhism, and specifically Tibetan Buddhism, in fiction like this. And the idea of having this occult group mixed in with actual historical spiritual figures from the history of Tibetan Buddhism was interesting. But there were just parts of it that like gave me a bad taste in my mouth. So I talk more about it in my review. I thought the story itself was fun. I thought the writing was good. I thought there was just a little bit of a feeling of cultural appropriation. But that could have just been me being sensitive. I don't know. But I have a much more extensive review coming out. Then back to some novellas. The next novella I read was Psychic Teenage Bloodbath by Carl John Lee. I had been planning on reading this for a while. Then I saw it being suggested again. And so I made sure it was on my TBR for this month because it's been on my TBR for a while. I just haven't gotten to it. And this is a story set in the 80s of 2 queer high school students who are victims of a hate crime, and one of them ends up in a coma. And in her coma, she develops psychic powers, and she just goes on a killing spree. And it is bloody, it is intense, it is graphic. There may or may not be an infant who is beat to death with a pair of crutches. So, that's what you're getting into. It was fun. It was great. It was so much fun. It's nonstop roller coaster ride that will leave you queasy in the stomach, questioning all of the characters, and not really happy at the end, but still like nothing is justified or fun, but you still had a good time. It's like if Stephen King's Carrie, except queer and much more grindcore and much more over the top and like deranged. So there you go. It was great, and it's a novella. You can read it in one sitting. And then after that, another novella, which was, maybe as far opposite as that as you can get. And this is called You Will Speak for the Dead by R.A. Busby. This is another advanced reader copy. I do have a review coming out. This was like I think of this as a gentle or a cozy body horror, which I know seems like a contradiction in terms, but the whole premise is that the young man who's our main character is like his life is in like a mess. His mother recently died, his boyfriend left him, he doesn't have any direction, he doesn't know what he's doing. And the irony is that his job is cleaning houses. So he's part of a company that goes to houses, like hoarder houses, and they clean them out. And so his life is about creating structure and, excavating what has been and making order out of the mess. That's his job. But in his own life, he can't do that. And they go to a house that was owned by an old biologist, and what he discovers in the house kind of transforms him. And that's kind of the heart of the story, is him navigating his grief and his loss and his trauma and his lack of direction through the mediation of this transformation that happens as a result of what he experiences at this house. And there is some body horror elements, but they're really short and like very gentle. And there is like a mix of like transcendentalist ideology. Almost every chapter starts with like a verse from a different transcendentalist poet, like Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, these kind of things. And this weird combination of transcendentalism and like returning to the earth and the solitude of being in the peace of nature with like the body horror elements and the idea of like a life unearthed, a life in chaos, a life that needs structure. It was just a really weird combination that was really sweet. It was really cozy, and it was a lot of fun. So I have a longer review of that coming up later in the month. I do recommend it though. Next, I read The Honjin Murders by Seishi Yokomitsu. And this was wonderful. This was written in the 1940s, and this is the first in a series of the most famous literary detective, or one of the most famous literary detectives in Japanese literature, Kosuke Kendeyachi. And so Seishi Yokomitsu wrote, I think, 77 different books that feature this character, this detective. And this is the first one. And this was written in the 1940s, but it was only translated into English in 2019. And since then, another 5 of the books have been translated. And I loved it so much, I grabbed all of them. So there are 6 books total of the 77 that have been translated. And this was wonderful. And I'm not the first person to say that. If, right in the beginning, when they have the blurbs, there is a blurb from Books and Bow. And Books and Bow, you might know, is the blog from Willow Reads Books, or Willow Talks Books, rather. And she says, never anything less than fun from beginning to end, a truly engrossing novel, a superb winter read. Now, to be fair, that same blurb is given in the second book. So I don't know what she's actually talking about, which novel she's referencing, but it's well placed. This is wonderful. It is so much fun. It is a locked room mystery set in 1937 Japan. And the premise of it, the first chapter, it's from this first person point of view of an author saying, I'm going to write a locked room mystery about this event that really happened. And the first and the last chapter are directly the author saying, I went to the place that it happened, and I looked at the land, and I understood what happened there. And then the whole center part is the story he tells, but he interjects throughout the story. And you can tell that he has such a love for detective fiction and for locked room fiction especially. And at some points in the story, he'll say, like, when he introduces the main character, or when he introduces the detective, for instance, which doesn't come until about halfway through the story, actually. When he introduces him, he says, like this other author did when he introduced his great detective, he did it this and this way, and I think that's good, so I'm going to do the same thing. And then he introduces him that way. So it's just very like a meta awareness of being in this genre that I thought was really wonderful. He pays homage to a lot of the greats, and he calls them out by name: Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, and so on. And there's a character in the story who loves detective mysteries and locked room mysteries especially. And so that meta aspect is part of the locked room mystery, has to do with the characters themselves loving locked room mysteries and therefore knowing how locked room mysteries work. So that it just seems like a widely meta concept for a novel coming from the 1940s. And then the main character, or when you finally meet him, which isn't until halfway through, this detective who ends up spawning another 76 books, he is really wonderful. He's like in his early 20s. He is like very almost antisocial. You could probably argue now that he is neurodivergent. His clothes are like rumpled and messy. He doesn't seem to pay any attention to social norms. But he is like a genius, and like all like the geniuses, detectives, once he solves something, instead of just saying what he solved, he wants others to figure it out on their own. So he's like baiting you the whole way. And it was just wonderful. And then the book ends again with the author the author of this fictional book saying, I never lied to you. I'm like, yes, I said this, but that's the reason I worded it this way and not this way, because I was never deceptive, or I was never lying. I was just like, walking around the truth. I just thought it was wonderful. I'm really excited to read the rest of them. The Holmgren Murders is the first one. I highly recommend it. Right now, there are 6 of these books published. They're published, at least here in India, by Pushkin Vertigo. I don't know what the plans are to translate more of them, but it was a lot of fun. Okay, moving into the home stretch now. The next book I read is another collection of short stories. This is called Tales Accursed, a folk horror anthology. This is also an advanced reader copy, so a more extensive review will be coming out later. But this was a collection of folk horror stories, as it sounds like, but specifically classical folk horror. So the earliest one was from 1870, and the most contemporary was by Shirley Jackson. And it was published after her death, so in like the 2000s, I think. But she died in the 1960s, so it would have been written before that. And the majority of these are all written between 1870 and like 1925 or so. The majority of them are all before 1930. Of the 16 stories, I think 12 of them were before 1930. And so there's no contemporary folk horror in here. I would have liked a little more contemporary folk horror, but if you know going into this that it's all classical, then it's a lot of fun. You'll recognize some of the authors, but most of them were new to me, like Algernon Black and these kind of things you'll know, and Shirley Jackson, obviously. A few others you'll probably recognize. A lot of them, at least for me, were new. And what I really loved about it was, even though I would have liked more contemporary, once you go in with the mindset this is going to be a classical collection, then you can appreciate it. And I liked watching the development of folk horror and the anxieties are and how those are manifest through the narration style and through the opposing forces in the stories. You could do a really good job of tracing it through the stories, through the decades. So I thought this was wonderful. I thought it was a lot of fun. If you're interested in folk horror, you definitely want to pick this up. I thought it was great. And I will also say that the editor is also a graphic artist, and he did linocut art for every one of the stories. So every one of the stories has its own piece of art, and so linocut looks like block printing, which is very fitting with folk horror. And those are good. I thought they were additive. And what I found compelling as a narrative structure is a lot of these stories I realized, and I don't know if I've ever realized it before because I haven't read this much classical folk horror back to back, but a lot of these stories are told as a story within a story. So you meet a character who then starts talking to another character and they tell them a story, and this makes sense. It gives you this feeling of sitting by a campfire and telling ghost stories to one another, right? And that they are telling a supposedly true story that happened to someone they know, which feels like what all urban legends start out as. So I thought that was a really interesting narrative device that is repeated throughout many of these stories across the decades. And it just goes to show like the way folk horror as a genre or as like a storytelling modality is so integrated with the importance of telling stories and that blurry line between reality and fiction. So I just thought it was a really interesting thing to see, the development of that narrative style, and having them all combined back to back was a good way to explore that. Okay, we're in the final stretch. The next book I read is Alan Wake by Richard Burroughs. This is the novelization of the video game. It's a very famous horror video game. Now has a sequel, and it's about an author whose wife goes missing. And this was not good. I haven't played the video game. I know people that have. I've heard a lot about the video game, which is why I was excited to read this. And it fell apart at all the places I want a novelization to lift up a story. I want to have more interiority from the characters. I want to have a better description of the environment, of the world building. And it just didn't give me any of that. It gave me very little interiority. The characters felt like very ham-fisted. They did not feel interesting at all. The plotting just felt like really jagged, and it felt like the plotting you'd get in a video game, but a video game that like cut out all of the narrative parts. So I did not enjoy this too much. Unfortunately, it was a quick read. It wasn't like offensive. It just wasn't very good. Moving on, the next book I read is Audition by Ryu Murakami, and this is the basis for the 1999 film, which I had seen the film and when I was in college, and it blew me away. And I must have seen it in 2002, and so 2002 was before Saw or Hostel or the new wave of torture porn cinema, and so before the new wave of us really becoming inoculated against like extreme violence. And this film was made by Takashi Miike, a cult director that is really beloved in certain circles. And this was the first film I'd seen of his. And when I saw it, it was at a screening at my college. And you organized by like a student group that does screenings. And at the beginning of the screening, they said, anyone that wants to leave can leave now and get a refund. But once the movie starts, we will not be issuing any refund, no matter at what point in the movie you leave. And so that like set the tone for my experience of the movie. I thought the movie was great. I loved Takashi Miike. I started watching as many of his films as I could. And actually, I don't think Audition is his best film. I really enjoyed it. But Visitor Q, Happiness of the Katsukuris, Ichi the Killer, the Dead Alive trilogy, all kind of bonkers films in their own ways. And so I was excited to read this novel to see where, at least Audition came from. And I will say, I think I liked the movie better because the novel falls into the same trap as the movie. So the basic premise is you have an early 40s widower who has a 15-year-old son, and his wife died of cancer like 7 or 8 years before the story starts. And the story starts with his son saying, "You should remarry because you're lonely." And he works in advertising, and he has a friend that works in film and media, and they decide basically to hold an audition for his new wife. And they set up this audition where all these women come and think they're auditioning to be in a movie, but he's really auditioning them to find a new wife. And he eventually becomes overwhelmed with one of them and falls head over heels with her. And things don't end well for him, let's say. And the thing is, the way it's structured is, at least in the movie, almost the first half is like this rom-com, essentially. And like this really kind of creepy rom-com, the kind of rom-coms you'd experience in the 1990s, where it wouldn't be weird that you were holding an audition for a wife, but nowadays you'd be like, that's really problematic. And that's what it feels like. And there are moments of dread inserted through, but you really have this kind of wholesome vibe with this awkward guy who's like doing the best he can to be a father and navigating the death of his wife and like, trying to do all these things. And then things take a turn about halfway through. In the book, that turn doesn't happen until about 70 or 80% of the way through. And that just makes the whole first part drag on so long and be so kind of uninteresting, really. Maybe if you didn't know the ending going into it, it would be more interesting. I don't know. But for me, it just seemed like really a lot of setup with a few moments of dread inserted. And, a few moments of like these ominous feelings or like foreboding. But for the most part, it was just like dragging on and not interesting. On top of that, like there are scenes, like the most disturbing scene in the movie, for instance, isn't in the book. So, there are still like really visceral, gory, violent scenes. But like the one scene that maybe the movie is most known for isn't in the book at all, which is fine. But it's just like the book is like a tamer version of the movie, which is also slower and takes longer for anything to happen. And, so I'm glad I read it. I don't think it was a bad book. I enjoyed the movie more. I am still interested in reading more books by Ryu Murakami, and a lot of them are on like the extreme horror genre or the disturbing horror genre. So I am interested to read more of him. I just was a little bit let down by Audition. Okay, moving on. Now, this book, the next one, I would never have read if it wasn't for GarbAugust. This is The Thornbirds by Colleen McCullough. And I read it because I was looking for a book that fit the prompt of the fourth week, which was something that had been made into a 1970s or 1980s miniseries. And I had a hard time finding anything. And when I saw this, this is a 700-page book, and I thought this was probably going to be like a soap opera or a melodrama, and it would never be anything I would have ever read if I didn't decide to push myself for this reading challenge. And I would have been so wrong. This was incredible. I'm so glad I read this book. This book doesn't really have a plot. It follows like 3 generations of a family who are Irish immigrants to New Zealand in the early 20th century and then moved to Australia right at the beginning of the story. And you start from the point of view of this young girl, and the first kind of generation is her mother's generation, and her as a child, then her as an adult, and then her children. And you follow this one family through about 60 years of their lives and the ups and downs of it. And so there isn't really plotting that happens. It's just like exploring their lives. And it was wonderful. The characters were so well developed and so interesting. And a lot of them just kept making awful decisions over and over again, but they made sense given the context for who and how they were. And there's a really wonderful depiction of a priest, and you end up spending time in Rome with this priest, and then bishops and cardinals and other things, and this depiction of this conflict of the intersection between spiritual life and worldly life, and what it means to actually have faith that like fulfills you and motivates you, and how that can conflict with your desire, like your worldly desires. I thought was really well handled. I thought everything in this book, like Yeah, I'm so glad I read this. I would never have read it if I wasn't pushing myself for this challenge. And if no other reason, reading this book alone made, was worth all the other books I read this month. I will say she has a way of describing things that sometimes goes on for a while. Like whenever you go to a new place, there's this like paragraph after paragraph about all the different plants that are there and all the trees and all the animals and all the smells and all the colors. And it just like some of this like description was like exhaustive and a little bit exhausting. But for the most part, if you get over that, it was oddly compelling for a story that doesn't have much of a narrative, that you always want to keep finding out more and more and more about what was going on in their lives. And I did not want to put the book down. I read it in just a few days, even though it was 700 pages, and I had a great time with it. I'm so glad I read it. Next book I read, my God, there's so many books this month, you guys. Sorcery and Small Magics by Mega Ducey. This is another advanced reader copy. This is a queer fantasy, almost enemies to lovers kind of story. Not quite a romance, not quite a romantasy. And the author describes it as enemies to friends to, it's the first in a trilogy. I didn't expect to go in liking it. It hits a lot of your expected tropes in like fantasy. Like you see all the pieces being put into play and then they happen, like when they get called back later, it makes sense. Like none of it's unexpected, none of it is surprising, and yet I loved this book. I thought it was great. I loved the characters, I loved the world, I liked everything about it. I read it in like a day, and I actually started this not expecting to finish it before the end of the month, and yet I read it in a day. It was so sweet, it was so gentle and charming. There are stakes, there are people's lives at risk. There are like really big stories happening. There's exploration of class, there of privilege. I just had a fun time with this book, way more than I expected to. So I have a longer review coming out later when it gets closer to publication. And then finally, the last book I read of the month, the last book of GarbAugust is Slugs by Sean Hudson. And this was the only book I had planned on reading this month, like the most specific book. I bought a copy of it, I think in June. Criminally, obviously, he's the one that has started GarbAugust, and he talks about this book all the time. And I really wanted to read it just for that reason. It feels like the right book to read during GarbAugust, and it just kept getting pushed back to the point where I thought I wasn't going to be able to read it in GarbAugust. And I picked it up, I think, the 29th of the month, and I finished it because it is such a fun read. And like it's a popcorn thriller. You don't want to put it down. I do think, the author, I had this version I have is from 2016, and there's a small preface by the author. And he talks about how this came about. And he had no interest in writing anything about slugs. He had a few stories about leeches and vampires that were like in his mind. And then his agent called him and said, write a book about killer slugs. And so he's like, okay. And he did. And it took him 3 months. And then it was done. And he was 23 years old when he wrote it. And I think if the same book were written now, like by him, for instance, I think it'd be better. Like I think the book itself, I'd give it like a B minus, but just in like the quality of the writing. I think you could write the same book with the same characters, the same basic plot and premise, but just do a better job of it. Just the pacing and the jumping back and forth sometimes felt a little bit scattershot. But with that said, I don't know. It's a book about killer slugs. Like what do you expect? And it was more realistic than I anticipated it to be. He went out of his way to keep it as close to reality as you can and still have an over-the-top creature feature, which I thought was actually really well done and really fun. So that was the last book I read in GarbAugust. It feels fitting, and it was exhausting, So that was it. 28 titles I finished this month. To really quickly go over the kind of prompts and things. So as far as decades go, if you start from the 1870s to now, the only decades I missed were the 1880s and the 1930s. And that collection of folk stories really helped me out since they covered so much of the early 19th century. And I did have other books chosen for everything from 1900 to present, but I ended up not having time to read them. So those short stories filled in. I did have a novel chosen for the 1930s, and I still want to read it. So hopefully I'll read that maybe in the next couple months, but I didn't get to it. But every other decade I managed to hit. And then as far as the prompts, the bingo board prompts, I got most of them. I got modern trash, host recommendation, trash in translation, green on the cover, you wouldn't read this on a bus, killer kids, cults, long-running series, killer animals, conspiracy theory, written under a pseudonym, more than 2 guns on the cover, based on a video game, exclamation point in the title, weirdly specific subgenre, kinky sex, and slasher. So that's most of them. I didn't get nudity on the cover, sexy vampire, vigilantes, moral panic, Moral Panic, some of the short stories maybe would have qualified, but I didn't really pick up that collection for that reason. So I don't think I got that one. Gangs, drugs, and ninjas and martial arts. So I didn't get those, but I still got more than half. Quite an impressive showing, I think. And that gets to my reflections on GarbAugust, which is that I'm tired. I am exhausted. You know, I love reading, and I enjoyed being part of this month of reading. But usually, when there are reading events, I stand the outside of them. And if I am inspired by them, I might read one book or something that like fits in with the theme of the reading month. I don't go out of my way to try to fill out a bingo card or to have an extensive TBR that I plan ahead of time. And this month I did a little bit of that. Like I picked up a few titles that I knew I'd want to read. But to do it well, you have to, if you really want to fill out a bingo card, you have to be strategic and choose books that hit multiple squares. And I'm so much more of a mood reader than that, combined with the fact that I do read a lot of advanced reader copies, and I feel an obligation to read those on time and to get reviews out before those books are published, both written reviews before they're published and then video reviews, within a week of their publication. And just like my anal retentive nature is that like if I'm given an arc, I feel a responsibility to get reviews out for all of them. So just balancing all that in this reading month was a lot. I think if I didn't have the free time due to the weird hiccup in our calendar at the monastery, then I wouldn't have made the attempt. But knowing I'd have more free time and knowing that next month, or this month as I record this, September is going to be really busy for me because I have exams and other things happening, that I'm not going to have as much reading time this month. I thought I might as well go all out in August, and I'm glad I did, but it was a little exhausting. And so I think in the future, I'm going to stick to, if there are like weekly prompts, maybe trying to hit those. But the idea of a bingo card is just hard because it gamifies reading for me. And I know that isn't the intent. And Criminali and other hosts very clearly say, like, if you read one trashy book, then you're taking part in GarbAugust. So from the host side, there's no gamifying. But when you create something like a bingo card for me, it's hard due to like my, addictive nature to not gamify it. And I don't like gamifying my reading. My reading, I like it to be for pleasure. I like it to be for personal exploration, for all these things. And so once it tries to be checking off boxes, then it becomes less interesting for me. And I don't want my reading to be that. And already there's the risk of having started a YouTube channel and feeling compelled to put out content to have that commodify my reading experience. And so I'm resisting that already. So to gamify it by looking at a bingo card and trying to check off boxes, especially when there's, 24 of them for a month, I think is not the best way for me to go about reading. And so I really am glad I did it this month. In the future, focusing on a much smaller TBR if I do participate in any kind of reading event. However, with all that said, if I hadn't been so gung-ho to read so many books this month, I never would have read The Thornbirds. And that alone is worth it because I had such a wonderful time with that book that never would have crossed my path. And on top of that, there are other books that I really enjoyed reading that I've wanted to read. Like I want to read more classic mysteries, and I want to read more classic sci-fi. And those are kind of things that I'm interested in reading, and yet they always fall their way to the bottom of my TBR because there's so many new and exciting things to read instead. And so being forcing myself to find classics that meet the prompts for this challenge was really a gift for me. So it did get me to read books that I wanted to read, but just always kind of escaped my attention. And it got me to read books that I never would have read otherwise. And I'm glad I did. Like none of the books I read this month do I regret reading. I'm glad I got to read all of them. And so that, I think, is the joy and the beauty of something like this. When you engage or participate in a reading event, that you can use it as an excuse to push yourself outside of your comfort zone and outside of your boundaries. And I don't mean that in terms of the page count or the number of titles you read. I think that can be destructive. But in terms of genres and in terms of what you let yourself be interested in. And that was the most rewarding part for me of my 2024 GarbAugust experience. So we'll see going forward in the future how gung-ho I am about events like this. But for this one, I kind of went all out just because the conditions were right that I was able to do it. And I'm glad I did. And I had a great time. And now I've been talking for more than an hour. Hopefully I can edit this to be shorter than that. In short, it's been a busy month, filled with trash. A month reading trashy fiction in and of itself wasn't novel for me. But pushing myself to read outside of my normal genres was. And just pushing myself to rearrange my TBR to meet someone else's expectations instead of my own mood expectations was an interesting experience, and I'm glad I did it. And I look forward to continuing to participate in book events, but maybe with a little bit less intensity going forward. But who knows? We'll see. Maybe I'll get really excited by whatever I see happening next. Who knows? For now, I'm going to have to end here. Thank you so much for spending any amount of time with me today. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves. Take care of each other and go slowly.